She had nothing left but a dead man's journal, a bag of recipes, and the kind of stubbornness that makes people either legends or cautionary tales. When Harlan Voss stood on the porch of her family's homestead and told Delaney Crowe she had until sundown to clear out, every soul in Ridgeback, Colorado watched, and not a single one stepped forward. They pitied her. Some even thought she deserved it. A woman alone, in debt, with dirt under her fingernails and no husband to speak for her. What chance did she have? This is the story of how a woman they all wrote off became the one person none of them could afford to ignore. Like and comment with the name of your city. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because this is only the beginning. The morning her father died, the sky over Ridgeback turned the color of old pewter, flat and sunless, like the world itself had decided not to bother. Delaney Crowe sat on the edge of Thomas Crowe's bed for a long time after his breathing stopped, her hands still wrapped around his. His fingers had gone stiff in that particular way that doesn't happen in sleep, the kind of stillness that has no return in it. And she stayed there anyway, because once she stood up, everything would begin. She was 31 years old. She had never been described as pretty, at least not by the kind of people whose opinions filled the air in Ridgeback. Strong-featured, some said, which was Colorado frontier code for a woman who didn't fit the decorative mold. Her hands were calloused from years of garden work and kitchen labor, her dark hair perpetually escaping whatever she'd tried to pin it into, her eyes the sort of gray-green that looked different depending on her mood, and lately they'd been iron-colored most of the time, because iron was what the situation called for. Thomas Crowe had been a decent man who made several indecent decisions in the back half of his life. That was the clearest way Delaney could put it without crying or cursing, and she'd learned to stick to the clearest way. He'd borrowed against the homestead twice, once when the drought killed the crops, and once when she never quite figured out why, though she suspected it had to do with his pride in a man named Harlan Voss, who smiled like a man who already knew the answer before he asked the question. She found the letter 3 days after the burial, tucked inside the cover of her father's ledger in his desk drawer. It wasn't really a letter, more of a notice, printed in clean block type on county stationery, informing Thomas Crowe that the debt on the property had been transferred to Voss Agricultural Holdings, and that payment of the full outstanding balance was due within 30 days of the notice date. The notice date was 6 weeks ago. Delaney read it twice. Then she sat down on the floor of her father's study, which she'd never done before in her life, and pressed her back against the desk and thought about what she actually had available to her. What she could sell, what she could borrow, who owed her anything, who might help. She went through every name in Ridgeback, methodically, the way she did with inventory. By the time she finished, she had a number she couldn't reach and a list of people who would sympathize but not act, which was basically the same as a list of people who would do nothing. She went to see Harlan Voss the next morning. His office was in the largest building on Ridgeback's main street, a 2-story brick structure that had previously been the Mercantile before Voss bought it and remodeled it into something that looked more like a bank than a store, because Voss understood that appearance was leverage. The front room had a large mahogany desk, a portrait of himself on the wall, a painting, not a photograph, which Delaney had always found instructive, and a man named Garrett who served as a kind of reception clerk and general enforcer, though he dressed as the former. "Miss Crowe," Garrett said without looking up from his papers. "Mr. Voss isn't expecting anyone this morning." "He'll want to hear this," she said. "I doubt that." "Tell him Thomas Crowe's daughter is here about the homestead debt." Garrett looked up then. Something passed across his face that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but was in the general neighborhood of both. He excused himself and she waited, standing, because she hadn't been invited to sit and she wasn't going to ask. Harlan Voss was 53 and built like a man who'd once been physically powerful and had since shifted that power into other forms. He was thick through the chest and shoulders, gray at the temples, and he dressed better than anyone else in Ridgeback by a significant margin. He came out of his back office with his hands in his jacket pockets and a look of mild professional sympathy that Delaney recognized immediately as rehearsed. "Miss Crowe," he said, "I'm sorry for your loss." "I'd like to discuss the debt," she said. "The letter said 30 days from the notice date. That date has passed, but my father died before he could have received proper notice of the transfer. There are grounds for an extension." Voss tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he's deciding how much patience to perform. That's a legal question, he said. My attorney handles those matters. Your attorney sets the terms and you approve them, she said. I'm asking you directly. I'm asking if there's a payment arrangement available. The land is worth at least 3 times the outstanding debt. I could work the property, take on contracted labor, make partial payments. Miss Crowe. His voice was gentle. It was almost worse when they were gentle. The debt is what it is. Your father understood the terms when he signed. My father signed under different circumstances, and you've transferred and repackaged that debt twice without proper disclosure. I've seen enough of the ledger entries to know that. Something shifted in Voss's expression. Not much, just a narrowing, almost imperceptible, like a door closing an inch. I'd be careful about making accusations you can't support, he said quietly. I'm not making accusations. I'm describing what I read. The meeting lasted another 12 minutes. Delaney laid out every argument she'd prepared, every alternative arrangement she'd calculated, every legal point she'd researched in her father's modest collection of land law references. Voss listened with the patience of a man who had already decided the outcome before she walked in and was simply waiting for her to finish. When she was done, he said, I'll have Garrett show you out. The eviction came on a Tuesday, which seemed both arbitrary and appropriate, because the worst things usually happened on unremarkable days. Voss arrived at the homestead at mid-morning with Garrett and 2 other men Delaney didn't recognize, and a county deputy named Aldrich, who had the grace to look uncomfortable, but not enough grace to do anything about it. Several of the neighbors had gathered at the property edge. Not to intervene, Delaney had understood that much already, but because word traveled fast in a small frontier town, and people liked to witness things, even when witnessing was all they intended to do. She'd had 2 days to prepare once the official notice arrived, which was enough time to make decisions about what could be carried and what had to be left. She'd left most of the furniture, she'd left the tools that were too heavy. She'd packed her father's journal, his leather-bound recipe collection that had actually been her mother's, the good cast-iron skillet, 3 changes of clothes, a blanket, and what remained of the household money, which came to $11.40. She walked out of the house carrying the bag herself. She didn't ask for help with it. She didn't say anything to Voss, who was standing near the fence with his hands in his pockets, watching with that same mild professional expression he'd worn in his office. She didn't say anything to the neighbors either, though she looked at each of them in turn, letting them look back at her, not blinking, because she wanted them to remember what this was. Old Hester Calloway, who lived a quarter-mile down the road and had known Delaney since she was a child, called out to her. "Delaney, honey, you can stay with us until—" "I'm all right," Delaney said. She didn't say it harshly, but she said it like she meant it. "Where will you go?" She didn't have an answer to that. She had the $11 and the bag and the road. "I'll figure it out," she said. She walked to the edge of the property, stepped off it, and kept walking. She'd heard about work available at some of the larger ranches to the north and west, not the small family operations that couldn't afford extra hands, but the real working outfits with crews large enough that a cook was a necessity, not a luxury. She'd heard the name Blackthorn Ranch mentioned a few times over the years in the context of Ridgeback's ranching economy. A solid operation, well-watered land, decent reputation. It was owned by a man named Cole Mercer, a widower, and it sat about 40 miles northwest of Ridgeback, in a valley between 2 ridgelines that caught more rain than the surrounding country. 40 miles on foot was not the same as 40 miles in a wagon, but Delaney had $11.40 and her pride, and the combination made her unwilling to spend money on transport. She could cover herself. She hitched a partial ride on the second day when a farm couple going to Oakhurst offered her a seat in their wagon bed and didn't ask too many questions, which she appreciated. The remaining 15 miles she covered on foot over a day and a half, sleeping the one night under a cottonwood by a creek that smelled like iron and cold mud. It was not a comfortable journey. Her boots raised blisters on the second day that she addressed methodically each morning with strips torn from her spare shirt, and the determination not to limp visibly, because limping looked like defeat, and she wasn't prepared to perform defeat for anyone, even the prairie grass. She ate sparingly because $11.40 was a finite number, and she didn't know how far it had to last. She talked to herself sometimes, which she'd never admitted to anyone, and would not have admitted then either if anyone had been listening, working through plans and contingencies in a low murmur that was less about reaching conclusions and more about maintaining the mental rhythm that kept her moving forward. On the third morning, she came down from a ridge and saw the valley. Blackthorn Ranch sat lower than the surrounding land, which was why it held water better. The terrain funneled runoff into the valley floor and into the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge. From above, she could see the main house, 2 large barns, a bunkhouse, several smaller outbuildings, and the organized scatter of a working operation that someone had built carefully over a long period of time. It was not a grand estate. It was a serious ranch, and there was a difference. She could also see from even this distance that things were slightly behind. The fence along the northern pasture had a section down. One of the barn roofs had a new patch that hadn't been painted to match. The kitchen garden, visible from the ridge, was producing but not flourishing. Things growing where they'd been planted but nothing laid out with intention. She filed that away and kept walking down. The ranch hand she encountered first was a young man named Pip. She'd learned later that his actual name was Philip Grantham and that he'd earned the nickname through an obscure incident involving a piglet and a water barrel that nobody could agree on the details of. He was 19, lanky, and he was attempting to repair a gate latch with a piece of wire that was clearly the wrong gauge. He looked up when she approached and blinked, because women who arrived at Blackthorn Ranch on foot carrying a single bag were not a common occurrence. "Morning," Delaney said. "Morning." He straightened. "You lost?" "No, I'm looking for work. Ranch cook, if there's a position. If not, I'll take whatever needs doing." Pip blinked again. "We've got a cook," he said. "Sort of." "Sort of?" He hesitated with the particular hesitation of someone deciding how much to say. "Old Hennessy does it," he said finally. "He's been doing it since before I got here. He's—" Another pause. "He's been here a long time." "Is the position open or not?" "You'd have to talk to Mr. Mercer." He pointed at the main house. "He's probably in the tack room this time of morning." She thanked him and walked toward the house. Pass. Cole Mercer was indeed in the tack room, doing something to a saddle that required his full attention and therefore gave him a reason not to look up immediately when she appeared in the doorway. He was somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed. Not a young man anymore, but not worn down the way some frontiermen were by 40, still straight through the back and deliberate in his movements. His hair was dark with gray at the edges, and he needed a haircut. He had the hands of a man who worked, not supervised. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He looked up. Whatever he'd expected to see in his tack room doorway, it apparently wasn't her. He set the saddle strap down. "Can I help you?" "My name is Delaney Crowe. I'm looking for work as a cook. I heard Blackthorn Ranch runs a crew large enough to need one." He studied her for a moment with the unselfconscious directness of a man who'd learned to read situations fast because slow reading cost you. "We've got a cook," he said. "I was told sort of," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but the precursor to it. "Hennessy's been cooking since '74, he said. "He knows what he's doing." "What's he making for supper tonight?" "Why?" "Because if you've been eating the same 7 meals for 11 years, there's an opening." Cole set both hands on the saddle and considered her. "Where are you coming from?" "Ridgeback." "Long walk." "Yes." "What happened in Ridgeback?" She looked at him steadily. "I lost the family homestead to a debt I couldn't cover fast enough. I'm not going to dress that up differently. I lost it. I left. I'm looking for work." He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his, and whatever he was reading in her face, he apparently found it satisfactory, or at least not immediately disqualifying, because he said, "You cooked professionally before?" "For 18 years in my father's house for a rotating crew of farmhands and seasonal workers, 3 meals a day. I can do basic baking, preserved goods, stretch provisions, adapt to what's available. I know beef, I know game, I know vegetables from scratch." "That's a lot of telling me," he said. "Not much showing me." "Give me your kitchen for 3 hours tomorrow morning, and I'll show you." He picked up the saddle strap again, turning it over in his hands. "Hennessy won't like that." "That's your problem to manage," she said. "I'm offering to cook for you. What you do about Hennessy is your affair." He made a sound that was somewhere between a sigh and a laugh, though it leaned closer to the sigh. "I've got a bunkhouse full of men who need to be fed," he said. And I've got a cook who's been reliable for a decade. I'm not replacing reliable for a stranger with a good argument. I'm not asking you to replace anyone, she said. I'm asking for 3 hours in a kitchen. If I don't outperform what you're currently getting, I'll walk back to Ridgeback and you'll never see me again. He was quiet for a long moment. You got somewhere to sleep tonight? She hadn't actually worked that out yet. I'll manage. There's a room off the kitchen that used to be the housekeeper's quarters, he said. It's not much. You can stay there tonight if you're going to cook tomorrow. I'll pay for the room out of the first week's wages if you hire me. That's assuming you get hired. I'm assuming I do. He looked at her again, longer this time, and then he nodded. Not warmly, but honestly, the nod of a man who'd made a provisional decision and knew it. 3 hours, he said. We eat at 6. Was. The housekeeper's room was small, probably 8 by 10 feet, with a narrow cot, a wooden stand with a basin, and a single window that faced the barn. The mattress had seen better decades. There was a nail in the wall where previous occupants had hung things. She hung nothing because she had nothing to hang, unpacked what she needed for morning, and sat on the edge of the cot with her father's journal in her hands. She'd been carrying it for 3 days without opening it. She'd been afraid of what she'd feel if she opened it, which was not a fear she admitted easily because she preferred not to be afraid of things she couldn't do anything about. But tonight, in the small dark room with the smell of hay coming through the window and the distant sound of the crew settling into the bunkhouse, she opened it. The journal was not an emotional document. Thomas Crowe had not been an emotional man in writing, whatever he'd been in person. It was mostly practical entries, the weather, yields, livestock counts, expenses, occasional notes on equipment. The handwriting got smaller and more cramped in the final years when his hands had started to trouble him. But on the second-to-last page, in the careful, deliberate script he used for things he considered important, he'd written, Delaney knows more than she lets on. She'll be all right. She sat with that for a while. Then she closed the journal, set it under the mattress where it would be safe, and went to look at the kitchen. The Blackthorn kitchen was a large room, which was its primary virtue. It had clearly been built to feed crews, with a long commercial-grade range and a cook's table that could seat 12. The pantry was stocked, though not organized. Provisions heaped and stacked without clear system, which meant things got missed and others got used up in wrong order. She inventoried it in an hour, moving quietly through the shelves with a candle. Noting what was there and what was low and what had been there so long, it needed to be used immediately before it turned. The range needed cleaning, not neglect cleaning. It wasn't black with grease, but the kind of thorough going over that told you someone had been cooking competently on it without thinking about it, which was a different thing from caring for it. There was a sourdough starter in a covered crock on the far shelf. She lifted the cover, smelled it. Healthy. Whoever had started it knew what they were doing, even if they weren't maximizing it. She went to bed at 10 and was up at 4. Well, by the time the sun came over the eastern ridge, the kitchen smelled like something the bunkhouse hadn't woken to in a while. She'd made biscuits from the sourdough starter, light with a good pull to them, and a skillet gravy from scratch using the pan drippings she'd found and the herbs she'd spotted going to waste in the neglected corner of the kitchen garden. She'd cooked a proper cut of the salt pork from the pantry reserves, done right so it didn't come out tough. She'd made coffee that was actually coffee, not the dark water that had apparently passed for it here. She'd also found a wheel of hard cheese that had been aging in the pantry longer than intended, and had become something quite good, which she put out sliced on a board with the last of a jar of preserved peppers she'd found at the back of a shelf. The first man into the kitchen was Pip, who stopped in the doorway exactly as he'd stopped in the gate doorway the day before with the same blinking quality. "Is that—" "Sit down," she said. He sat. He ate. He said nothing for several minutes, which she took as a good sign. The others came in gradually. A crew of 7. She'd learned their names over the next days, though she caught several that morning. There was Rooster, the senior hand, a weathered man in his 50s who came in looking skeptical and ate with the methodical determination of a man refusing to admit something was better than he expected. There was Dex, who was younger and didn't bother hiding his appreciation. There were 4 others who occupied the spectrum between those positions. And then there was Hennessy. He was a small, neat, white-haired man of about 65 who entered the kitchen and stopped when he saw her and the breakfast, and the expressions on the crew's faces, and something passed through his own face that she felt genuinely bad about. It wasn't anger. It was worse than anger. It was the look of a man realizing something. "You're the woman from yesterday," he said. "Delaney Crowe." She extended a hand. "Your sourdough starter is excellent. I used it this morning. I should have asked." He looked at her hand. He shook it briefly. He sat down and she put a plate in front of him, and he ate without comment. Cole came in last, as she'd expected. The habit of men who run things to arrive after their people are settled. He came in, saw the room, saw the plates, saw the biscuits. He sat, she poured him coffee. He drank it without looking at her, which she recognized as the neutral ground of a man evaluating. When everyone had finished, she stood at the head of the table and said, "I want to walk through the pantry and the kitchen garden with whoever's responsible for provisions. I want to reorganize the storage system and address some things that are going to spoil if they're not used in the next week. That's on top of whatever the regular meal schedule looks like." Rooster looked at Cole. Cole looked at Delaney. 3 hours, he said. "This is 3 hours, she said. "I started at 4. The silence that followed was the good kind, the kind that precedes a decision that's already been made. Hennessy found her in the garden that afternoon, where she was inventorying what was growing and making notes on what needed to be planted for the fall push. She heard him coming but didn't turn around until he was close enough for a conversation. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I've been cooking at this ranch for 11 years. His voice was steady, not angry, but she could hear the weight underneath it. "Mr. Mercer has been fair with me. The men have never complained." "I know," she said. "You made it look—" He stopped, started again. "You made me look bad in front of them." She set down her notebook. "I didn't mean to make you look anything," she said. "I needed to show him I could do the job. That's all. It amounts to the same thing." She looked at him directly. "You're right," she said. "It does, and I'm sorry for that. I wasn't thinking about how it would land for you, and I should have been." He was quiet for a moment, apparently having expected something different. "You really walked from Ridgeback?" "Yes." "Why didn't you stay? Family." "No family left." He was quiet again, longer. "I don't need much," he said finally. "I'm not a man who needs much. I just need to know where I stand." "Cole will decide that," she said. "Not me." "He already decided," Hennessy said. "He told me this morning. He's going to keep you on. He offered me a different role, maintenance and supply runs to Oakhurst. Said the travel money was better than the cook's wage." He said it matter-of-factly, but she could hear him organizing something in his voice. "I'm considering it. It's honest work," she said. "Everything I've done here has been honest work." "I know," she said. "I can see that in your kitchen." He considered her for another moment, then nodded, the way older men do when they've reached the end of something they were carrying. "Don't let the tomatoes get too far," he said, looking at the garden. "They need thinning on the south side, or you'll get too much competition on the roots." "Thank you," she said. He walked back toward the house. Delaney's first real conversation with Cole Mercer beyond the functional happened 9 days after she arrived, and it happened the way real conversations often do, sideways, when both people were occupied with something else. She'd been using the late evening hours to repair what she could, in the kitchen and garden while the light lasted, and she was mending a tear in the canvas that covered the firewood stack near the back of the house when Cole came around the corner to check the stack level. He stopped when he saw her. "You don't need to do that," he said. "It needs doing," she said, "and I'm here." He looked at what she was doing for a moment, the careful, close stitching she was running along the tear. "You're good with your hands," he said. "I learned to fix things that needed fixing because there was nobody else to fix them." He was quiet then. "How long were you running the homestead? Before—" 8 years, she said, "more or less since my mother died. My father ran the operation, but I ran the house, the garden, the crew kitchen, the accounts when he'd let me." "He'd let you sometimes?" "He was better about it when things were going badly, which is backwards, but it's how men often are." Cole made a sound that might have been agreement. He leaned against the post of the firewood shelter and watched her work for a moment. "You said you lost the land to debt. Was it coming a long time?" She tied off a stitch. "I think so. I didn't see the shape of it until the end." She paused. Harlan Voss. The name did something to his expression. She noticed it even in the fading light, a particular settling, like something solidifying. "You know him," she said. It wasn't a question. The stillness in his face had answered before he did. "He owns land south of here," Cole said carefully. "We've had dealings." "Good dealings or bad ones?" He was quiet for a beat too long. "Cole," she said, setting the needle down and looking at him directly, the way she'd learned to look at men when she needed them to stop performing carefully and just say the thing. "What kind of dealings?" He looked out toward the north pasture for a moment. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's does when he's deciding something. "He's made 2 approaches about the water rights on the Eastern Creek," he said, "about 4 years apart. The second one was 6 months ago." "What kind of approaches?" "First one was a purchase offer, lowball but framed politely." "And the second?" "Less polite," he said. Delaney was quiet for a moment, her hand still in her lap. "What does he actually want?" "The water rights give access to about 9 miles of reliable creek in a dry county," Cole said. "If he controls that water, he controls who farms and ranches in this valley." She'd spent enough years watching Harlan Voss work to understand the geometry of it immediately. He didn't want the land. He wanted the leverage. The water was leverage, over every small operation in the valley, over every farmer and rancher who'd built their life around that creek. "He'll come back," she said. "He always comes back. And the third approach won't look like the first 2. Cole looked at her. "How do you know that?" "Because that's how he works." She picked up the needle again, started the next stitch. "I watched him do it to my father over 7 years. First it's a reasonable offer, then it's a reasonable seeming loan, then it's a legal mechanism you didn't see coming because you were watching for the thing that would look like a threat." "You think he's already started?" It wasn't a question either. She looked at him directly. "I think you should look carefully at any county filings on your property from the last 18 months, she said, "and I think you should know the name of every lawyer Voss has ever used in Mesa County." Cole was quiet for a long moment after she said that. The darkness had settled fully around the ranch now, the yard lit only by the lantern above the barn door and the thin line of light from the bunkhouse window. "Why are you telling me this?" he said finally. "Because I came here from losing everything to that man," she said. "And I'm not interested in watching it happen to someone else." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who isn't sure whether to feel warned or grateful and was settling somewhere between the two. "Thank you," he said finally. He said it simply, without the performance of it. "Don't thank me," she said. "Look at those county filings." He pushed off from the post and walked back toward the house. She finished the stitching in the dark because the tier needed to be closed, and leaving things half done was a habit she'd never been able to afford. The crew took to her the way crews do when someone feeds them well and doesn't make them perform gratitude for it. Gradually, then completely. Rooster came around first, which surprised her because he'd seemed the most set in his skepticism. But she learned that Rooster's skepticism was a professional habit rather than a personal one. And once she'd demonstrated consistently that she knew what she was doing, he'd shifted to a loyalty that was uncomplicated and durable. Dex taught her the ranch's supply rhythms without being asked, because he was the kind of 23-year-old who liked being useful and had found someone who let him be useful in a real way. The other hands found their own accommodations with her presence. She was not a woman who required accommodation in the social sense, which they appreciated because frontier men generally preferred people who didn't require managing. She learned the ranch. She learned which of the pastures held water longest, which fence lines needed the most attention, which horses had particular temperaments. She learned these things not because they were her job, but because understanding the whole operation made her able to do her actual job better, and because she was constitutionally unable to be somewhere without understanding how it worked. And she thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about him in the quiet hours after the kitchen was cleaned and the crew was in the bunkhouse and the ranch settled into its nighttime rhythms. She thought about the pattern of his methods, the way you think about a problem you haven't solved yet, but that you understand well enough to know the shape of. He moved slowly and methodically, building legal and financial positions over years before he moved overtly. He used county infrastructure, filings, claims, procedural mechanisms as weapons because they were weapons that looked like bureaucracy. He used rumors and reputation damage as a softening tactic before the real blow came. She'd watched him do all of this to her father, and she'd been too young and too inexperienced and too far inside it to name what she was seeing until it was too late. She was none of those things now. She pulled out the notebook she'd begun using for ranch business and started a second section, separate from the kitchen and garden inventories. In it, she wrote down everything she knew about how Harlan Voss operated, every technique she'd observed, every intermediate step she'd missed in her father's situation until too late. She wrote it like a field guide, clinical and specific, because that was how it needed to be written to be useful. When she had it organized, she read it back to herself in the lamplight of the housekeeper's room, and what she saw was not a defeated woman's grief or anger. It was a map of something she now understood completely, drawn by someone who had survived the cost of not understanding it in time. She closed the notebook, put it away, and went to sleep. She was 31 years old. She'd arrived with $11.40, a bag of recipes, and her dead father's journal. She had $11 left in the journal and the recipes, and she also had a kitchen that was finally running the way a kitchen should run, and a crew that ate well, and a rancher who was listening to her when it mattered. It wasn't what she'd had in Ridgeback. It was something else entirely, and she hadn't decided yet what to call it. Outside, the Colorado night settled over the Blackthorn Valley, cold and full of stars, the kind of sky that made no promises and kept none, that simply was what it was, wide, indifferent, and magnificent in the way of things that don't care whether you're watching. She slept, and tomorrow the kitchen would need her at 4. The county filings took Cole 3 days to pull together, because Mesa County's record office was understaffed and the clerk who managed land documentation had a system that prioritized his own convenience over anyone else's ability to find anything. Cole made the trip to Oakhurst himself, which surprised Delaney when he mentioned it. She'd expected he would send someone, but she was beginning to understand that Cole Mercer was a man who handled the things that mattered personally and left delegation for the things that didn't. He came back on a Thursday evening, rode in later than usual, and came directly to the kitchen while she was finishing the cleanup from supper. He set his hat on the table and sat down without being invited, which he'd never done before, and that told her the answer before he opened his mouth. "There's a water rights inquiry filed 8 months ago," he said. "County procedure. It's framed as a general survey. Happens every few years, supposed to be routine. But the requesting party is listed as Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust." Delaney set down the dish towel. "And Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust is... I don't know yet. That's what I need to find out." "It's Voss," she said, "or it's a vehicle he controls. He did the same thing in Ridgeback through a holding company, used a name that sounded civic in general, so nobody looked twice at it." Cole leaned back in the chair, rubbing the back of his neck with one hand. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had expected a problem and still found it draining to confirm it. "If it's a survey inquiry, that's not a claim," he said. "That's just paperwork." "That's not just paperwork," she said. "That's the first step. He uses the survey as a baseline to establish a prior interest argument later. If his filing predates any counter-documentation from you, he can claim your water usage was operating in an undefined legal space." She paused. "I'm not an attorney, but I watched him make this exact argument in front of a county commissioner about my father's irrigation rights. The commissioner bought it." Cole looked at her steadily. "How do you know all this?" "Because I spent 2 years after the fact reading everything I could find about how we lost," she said. "When you can't fix something, you at least learn it completely, so it can't surprise you again." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I need a lawyer." "You need a lawyer in Oakhurst who hasn't done work for Voss," she said. "That narrows it." "Do you know who he's used?" "In Ridgeback, he used a man named Cutter, but he operates in multiple counties. I can write down what I remember about his legal network, and you can start there." Cole nodded slowly, the nod of a man reorganizing something in his head. "All right," he said. "Do that." She pulled her notebook from the shelf where she kept it. The second section, the one she'd started building in the lamplight after everyone else was asleep, and set it on the table in front of him. He looked down at it. She watched his face as he read through the first several pages, the careful clinical accounting of Harlan Voss's methods and timeline. "You wrote all this," he said. "It helped to have it organized." He read for another few minutes without speaking. When he closed the notebook, he set his hand flat on the cover for a moment in a gesture she couldn't quite name, something between acknowledgement and weight. "This is thorough," he said. "It needs to be thorough," she said. "That's the only thing that works against someone who plans carefully." He looked up at her. "You should have been a lawyer." "I probably should have been a lot of things," she said. "But I'm a cook at a ranch in Colorado, so let's work with what's available." He almost smiled at that. It was brief and quickly controlled, but she saw it. October came in cold, the way Colorado Octobers do. Not gradually, but as a decision, a hard turn from one state to another. The kitchen became more important as the temperature dropped, because warmth and food are the same thing by different names when the wind comes off the ridge with that particular edge. Delaney expanded the baking, shifted the menu toward the heartier provisions that cold weather ranch work demanded, started keeping the range burning lower and longer instead of the intense heat of summer cooking. The crew had stopped treating her like a novelty somewhere around the end of the third week. She'd crossed whatever invisible threshold existed between being assessed and being simply present, and the change in the room when she walked into it was the change of someone who belonged rather than someone being evaluated. Rooster had started checking with her before he went to Oakhurst for supply runs, which was a form of respect she recognized because it was the form she'd had to earn in every situation she'd ever been in. Pip, who turned out to have a genuine aptitude for the kitchen garden, started spending his off hours helping her with the fall planting when he could have been doing almost anything else. He didn't explain why, and she didn't ask, but she suspected it was partly because he was a young man far from wherever he'd come from, and the kitchen was a warm room where someone paid attention to him without requiring anything back. She taught him how to tend the root vegetables for winter storage, the angle of the cellar venting, the layering of the root beds, which varieties kept longest. He listened the way young people do when someone is teaching them something real rather than performing instruction at them. "You really made this all up yourself?" he said one afternoon, looking at the organized cellar shelves that had been a pile of unsorted vegetables 2 weeks prior. "The system? My mother made up half of it," she said. "I improved it." "Where's your mother?" "Gone. Long time ago." He processed this with the directness of someone his age. "My mother's in Missouri," he said. "She doesn't know I'm here." "Does she know you're alive?" "Yeah, I write. She writes back." He paused. "She worries." "Good," Delaney said. He looked at her. "Good? Better she worries than she doesn't notice." Pip was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "My father doesn't write," he said. "Then write to your mother." He did, she noticed, that week and apparently several weeks after, because he started asking Hennessy, who now made the Oakhurst supply runs, to post a letter each time he went. She found out about the new filing on a Tuesday, which continued to be the universe's preferred day for delivering unwelcome information. When Cole came back from an unplanned trip to Oakhurst with an expression that had the specific flatness of someone managing anger carefully, he found her in the kitchen. He waited until the two hands who'd been eating a late lunch finished and took their leave, and then he set a document on the table. "The survey inquiry has been upgraded to a formal water rights contestation," he said. "Filed 3 weeks ago. I didn't know about it because my name isn't on the primary notice. It went to a general county land address." Delaney read the document. It was dense with legal language, but the structure of it was clear enough. Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust was contesting Blackthorn Ranch's claim to unrestricted use of the Eastern Creek, alleging that the water rights had never been formally registered under post-statehood land codes, and that the creek's use constituted a public waterway under county jurisdiction, which, if established, would give any party with a county permit the right to draw from it. "This is the mechanism," she said. "What do you mean?" "He doesn't want to take your creek. He wants to establish county control over it. Then he gets the county permit, which he can get because he has people in the county office, and he controls who draws from the creek and under what conditions." She set the document down. "It's cleaner than direct ownership, less visible." Cole stood across the table from her, his arms crossed, and she could see him working through it. "My grandfather built this ranch on the understanding that the creek was Blackthorn water," he said. "That was never contested. Which is exactly why there's no formal registration," she said. "Why would he have registered something nobody was disputing?" "So the legal gap is real." "The legal gap is real. What Voss is doing is exploiting a gap that exists in thousands of frontier land claims because nobody bothered formalizing things that were understood. But a court doesn't care about understood. A court cares about documented. Cole uncrossed his arms and put both hands flat on the table, leaning on them slightly, thinking. The lawyer I found in Oakhurst, Alderman, says we can file a counter-registration with historical use documentation, deeds, testimony from people who've been on this land, water use records. That's right, she said. That's the move. But you need to move fast because the longer his filing sits without a response, the more it looks like an uncontested claim. Alderman wants to start immediately. It'll cost. How much? He named a number. She looked at him. Can you cover it? She said. It'll hurt, he said flatly. The cattle prices this season were lower than projected. I've got reserves, but using them for legal fees means I'm operating lean through winter. Operating lean through winter is recoverable, she said. Losing the water rights isn't. He looked at her for a moment. You're very direct, he said. Do you want me to be less direct? No, he said. He paused. It's useful. She pushed the document back toward him. Tell Alderman to file the counter-registration. Give him everything you have, deeds, your grandfather's original papers if you kept them, anything in writing that places water use at Blackthorn before Voss's holding company existed. There are letters, Cole said. Old correspondence. I haven't looked at them in years. Look at them tonight, she said. He picked up the document, stood there for a moment like he was going to say something else, then apparently decided against it. He was almost to the door when she said, Cole. He turned. He's going to escalate when this doesn't work, she said. The legal approach is phase 1. When you counter it effectively, he'll move to something less clean. You need to be ready for that. He looked at her steadily. What does less clean look like? Rumors, she said. Reputation. He'll try to isolate you from your neighbors and from anyone in the county who might support you. He'll find something, or invent something, that makes people unsure about standing beside you. Cole held her gaze. He'll use you, he said quietly. A woman who showed up from nowhere with a bag and a story. That'll be part of it. She'd already thought about that. She'd thought about it in the lamplight hours, lying in the housekeeper's room that was now simply her room, her notebook on the stand beside her, her father's journal under the mattress. Probably, she said. It doesn't change anything, she said. What needs doing needs doing. Whether he uses me as a weapon doesn't change whether the thing needs doing. Cole was quiet for a long beat. Something moved in his face. Not pity, which would have been the wrong thing, and he seemed to know it. Something more like recognition. Like he was seeing clearly what kind of person he was dealing with and recalibrating accordingly. I'll look at the letters tonight, he said. He left. She turned back to the kitchen and started preparing supper, because the crew would eat at 6 regardless of county filings and legal contests and the shape of the threat that was building quietly in the valley below them. The letters were useful. Cole found 3 decades of correspondence that established Blackthorn's water use as continuous, specific, and exclusive, references to creek levels, irrigation schedules, disputes with neighboring farms that had been mediated on the assumption of Blackthorn's primary access. Alderman called it a solid foundation. The counter-registration was filed before the end of the month. Rooster found out about the situation the way the crew found out most things. Not through any deliberate announcement, but through the accumulation of overheard fragments and the particular quality of the conversations Cole and Delaney had at the kitchen table when they thought the house was empty. He brought it to Delaney directly, which she respected. There's something going on with the water rights, he said. He'd come in early for coffee, and they were alone in the kitchen. He said it with the tone of a man who wasn't asking a question so much as opening a door. She poured his coffee and leaned against the counter. Harlan Voss has filed a contestation, she said. Cole is countering it legally. It's being handled. Rooster wrapped both hands around the mug. Voss, he said. I know that name. Most people in this part of Colorado know it eventually. He bought out the Ferris operation 2 years back, Rooster said, over near Cedar Flat. Heard the Ferris family never really understood how it happened until they were already out. That's his pattern, she said. Rooster looked at her. He was a man who'd spent 30 years reading situations, and she could see him doing it now, placing her in the story, understanding the connection. That's why you're here, he said. From Ridgeback. That's part of why I'm here, she said. He drank his coffee. The men should know, he said. That's Cole's call. Cole's not good at telling people things, Rooster said, without heat, just accuracy. He manages. He doesn't communicate. I know, she said. You could tell them. She shook her head. It needs to come from him. If it comes from me, it looks like I'm running something I'm not supposed to be running, and that gives Voss something to use. Rooster considered this. You think about things, he said. I've had reasons to. He finished the coffee and stood. For what it's worth, he said, whatever this crew can do, when it gets to that point, you should know they'll do it. They're good men. I know they are, she said. I've been feeding them for 2 months. He went out. She stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the eastern ridge where the sky was going pale with early light, and thought about what came next. Cole told the crew at supper that Friday. He didn't make a production of it. He simply waited until the eating had settled into the quieter conversational phase and then laid it out plainly. The legal situation, the filing, the counter-registration. He didn't minimize it or perform confidence about the outcome. When he finished, Dex said, So what do we do? We document everything, Cole said. Rooster, I need records of every water draw from the creek going back as far as anyone has written anything down. Dex, same for the irrigation on the south pasture. Pip, the garden logs if Delaney can spare them. They're already organized, Pip said with a glance toward Delaney that she pretended not to notice. Good. Cole looked around the table. Alderman thinks the counter-registration is solid, but Voss doesn't give up when the legal move fails. He tries something else. I want everyone on this ranch paying attention. If you hear something in Oakhurst on the road from anyone, I need to know about it. The crew was quiet for a moment. Then Rooster said, We're with you, Cole, in the uncomplicated way of a man who'd already made that decision and didn't need much ceremony around it. The others added their versions of the same statement in varying degrees of articulation. Pip said it most simply, whatever you need. Cole nodded. He didn't make a speech about it. He said, All right, and picked up his fork, and that was the meeting. Delaney was clearing plates when she became aware that Cole was watching her from across the table. Not in a way that required a response, just a look, the kind that holds more than whatever would have been said out loud. She met it for a moment, then carried the plates to the kitchen. The crew sat a little longer than usual that night, talking in the easy way men do when they've been told something heavy and need to move it between them before they can set it down. She could hear them through the kitchen wall, Rooster's low, deliberate voice, Dex's quicker cadence, Pip asking a question someone answered. The sound of it was not unhappy, she thought. It was the sound of people who'd decided something together. The ranch would not be an easy thing to take from these people. She'd known that in different ways since she arrived, but she knew it more fully now, listening to the crew settle into itself on the other side of the wall, in the lamplight of a November evening in Colorado with the wind picking up outside and the first serious cold of the season pressing in around the eaves. She washed the dishes and thought about Harlan Voss somewhere in his brick office in Ridgeback, with his portrait on the wall, making calculations. She thought about what he'd reach for next when the legal route ran into Alderman's counterfiling. She thought about what she'd written in her notebook and what she hadn't written yet, because some of it she didn't know until it arrived. She dried her hands and picked up the notebook and opened it to the next blank page. She started writing. The rumors reached Blackthorn on a Wednesday, carried by Hennessy, who had driven the supply wagon into Oakhurst and come back with flour, salt pork, and the particular expression of a man who had heard something he didn't want to be the one to repeat. He found Delaney in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment, still in his coat, which told her he'd come directly to her before unloading the wagon. That told her something else, too. Say it, she said. Hennessy took his hat off. He turned it in his hands once. There's talk in Oakhurst, he said, about you and Cole. She kept her hands moving on what she was doing, portioning dried beans into jars for storage, a task that didn't require her eyes. What kind of talk? The kind that suggests you came here with a purpose that isn't cooking. He said it carefully, not cruelly, the way an older man does when he respects the person he's delivering bad news to and doesn't want to perform it. There's a story going around that you were sent here, that someone is using you to get access to the ranch's papers and finances, that you and Cole are... He stopped. That the nature of your relationship isn't what it appears. She finished counting the beans, set the jar down, turned to face him. Where's it coming from? Nobody's saying directly. It's the kind of thing where nobody knows where they first heard it, which means it was put there carefully. Voss, she said. Hennessy nodded once. He didn't look surprised that she'd named him, and she didn't look surprised that he'd confirmed it. There's more, he said. I'm sorry to say there's more. Someone told the alderman's clerk, the attorney's clerk, that you were involved in a financial dispute back in Ridgeback, that you manipulated a sick man's accounts. The room was very quiet for a moment. My father, she said. I don't know the specifics of what they're saying. I only heard the shape of it. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed for a moment. Not because she was going to cry, she wasn't, but because the specific ugliness of it needed a second to be absorbed. Using her dead father, twisting the loss into evidence of guilt. It was precisely the kind of move she'd written about in her notebook under the heading Character Attacks, and she'd written it there because she'd known it was coming, and knowing it was coming did not make it land any lighter. Does Cole know? She said. Not from me. You should be the one. Yes, she said. Thank you, Hennessy. He put his hat back on and went to unload the wagon. She stood in the kitchen for another minute, then took off her apron, folded it over the table's edge, and went to find Cole. He was in the north pasture checking fence with Dex, and she walked out to him across the cold November ground without a coat, which she didn't notice until she was already there. Cole saw her coming from a distance and said something to Dex, who took the fence tools and moved off down the line with the practiced discretion of a man who understood when he wasn't needed. She told Cole everything Hennessy had said, standing in the pasture with the wind pulling at her hair. She told it plainly, without softening or dramatizing, the same way she'd told him things from the beginning. When she finished, he was looking at the middle distance between them and the ridge. His jaw was tight. The thing about my father's accounts, she said. I want you to hear directly from me. It's false. I managed his accounts because he asked me to, and because his hands made the writing difficult in the last 2 years. There was nothing improper. Cole looked at her. I know that, he said. I need you to have actually said that, she said, out loud, before anything else. I know that, Delaney. His voice was quiet and certain, not performed certainty, the real kind, which is quieter. I've watched you work for 2 months. I know who you are. She held his gaze for a moment, and something in her chest that had been clenched since the kitchen released slightly. Not completely, but enough. All right, she said. The question is what to do about it, Cole said. He turned and looked down the fence line, then back at her. Alderman needs to know. If Voss is planning stories with the attorney's office, that's a problem for the counter-registration. It's meant to be a problem for the counter-registration, she said. If he can make Alderman uncertain about the integrity of his client's situation, then our legal filing gets complicated by association, Cole said. He'd understood it quickly. She'd noticed that about him from the early conversations. He didn't need things explained twice. He's trying to contaminate the legal case by contaminating the people making it. Yes. She crossed her arms against the cold she'd stopped noticing until now. And he's trying to isolate you from anyone in the county who might stand with you. If people think you're harboring a woman of questionable character, stop, Cole said. She looked at him. I don't want you talking about yourself that way, he said. Even in the context of what other people think. That's not... He paused, working out the words. That's not how I want this conversation to go. She studied his face. He meant it. Not as a performance of chivalry, but as an actual preference, a line he'd drawn without quite announcing he was drawing it. She wasn't sure what to do with that, so she set it aside for the moment. What I was going to say, she said carefully, is that he's using me as a tool to discredit you, which means the best thing I can do is stop being a useful tool. I need to be visible, and I need to be visible on my own terms before he finishes defining me on his. Cole frowned slightly. What does that mean, visible? It means I need to go into Oakhurst, she said, not hide here and let the story grow in my absence. I need to be somewhere public, talk to people, let them see who I actually am rather than who Voss is telling them I am. That's a risk, he said. If the story's already spread, the story's only been spreading for however long since he planted it. It hasn't had time to calcify. But if I stay away, it does. Absence looks like guilt. That's what he's counting on. Cole looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of cold grass and the distant hint of snow on the high peaks. "You're sure about this?" he said. "I'm not sure about anything," she said. "I just know what happens if I do nothing. I've seen that outcome." He nodded, slow and deliberate, the way he made all his decisions. "When?" "Saturday," she said. "The market day. Most people from the surrounding ranches will be there. That's where the story is living right now. In conversations at market stalls and outside the feed store. That's where it needs to be met." Cole was quiet for another moment. Then, "I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm saying I will." She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady directness that she'd come to understand was not blankness, but its opposite. A man fully present, fully decided, not performing support, providing it. "All right," she said. They walked back to the ranch house. She realized about halfway there that she'd been out in the cold for 15 minutes without a coat and hadn't noticed, which seemed like useful information about the state of her own concentration. Oakhurst on a Saturday had the compressed, layered quality of a frontier market town, making the most of the one day when everyone converged. The main street ran 3 blocks of commerce: feed and grain, dry goods, the butcher, 2 saloons, a hotel, the assay office, a small post office that also served as the informal message center for the surrounding ranching community. On market days, the street widened with wagons and temporary stalls, and the noise of it carried in a way that made the town feel twice its actual size. Delaney had been to Oakhurst twice since arriving at Blackthorn, both times for specific errands, in and out. She'd spoken to people she needed to speak to and nobody else. She had not introduced herself, had not lingered, had not made herself known as anything beyond a woman with a list of things to purchase. Today was different, and she knew it, and she could feel it as she and Cole came down the main street with Hennessy driving the wagon. The slight shift in people's attention, not dramatic, but there, the way a room changes when someone enters who has been talked about. She kept her shoulders level and her face neutral, and she looked at people directly, which was the most important thing. People who have something to hide don't look directly. She was not going to look like someone with something to hide. Their first stop was the feed store, because that was the legitimate purpose of the trip. While Cole and Hennessy dealt with the order, Delaney walked to the dry goods counter and found Margaret Hale, who ran the store with her husband and who Delaney had spoken to briefly on her second Oakhurst visit. Margaret was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, with the manner of a woman who had run a business in a small town long enough to have an accurate picture of most things. "Miss Crowe," Margaret said. She said it without expression, which could have meant anything. "Mrs. Hale." Delaney set her list on the counter. "I need these items if you have them, and I also want to ask you something directly, if you're willing." Margaret looked at the list, then up at her. "All right. I've heard there are stories circulating about me, about my history in Ridgeback, and about my situation at Blackthorn Ranch." She said it evenly, the way she'd said difficult things in difficult rooms before. "I want to tell you what's true, if you'll hear it, because I'd rather you have the accurate version than the one that's going around." Margaret studied her for a long moment. The store had a few other customers, and Delaney was aware of the slight quieting that meant people were listening without appearing to listen, which was fine. That was actually what she needed. "Go ahead," Margaret said. Delaney told her the condensed truth: her father's death, the debt to Voss, the eviction, the walk to Blackthorn, the job she'd earned through 3 hours in a kitchen, the water rights contestation she'd helped Cole identify and begin to counter. She said it plainly and specifically, with the kind of detail that invented stories don't have, because invented stories are always slightly too smooth. When she finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harlan Voss?" "Yes. He bought the Whitmore property last spring," Margaret said. "Family couldn't figure out how they ended up owing what the papers said they owed." "That's consistent with his method," Delaney said. "You're saying he's coming for Blackthorn." "He's already started. Cole has a lawyer filing the counterclaim." Margaret picked up the list and began moving through the store to pull the items. "My husband sits on the Merchants' Council with 2 men who've done business with Voss," she said, over her shoulder. "Neither of them will say anything outright, but neither of them is happy about it." She came back with a wrapped parcel. "I'll tell you something, Miss Crowe. The story about you that's been going around, I heard it last week and it didn't sit right. Too neat, too conveniently pointed. Thank you, Delaney said. Don't thank me. You did the right thing coming in and saying it straight. She set the parcel on the counter. There are others who need to hear it the same way. The others came in the form of encounters that Delaney had not entirely planned, but had made available by being present, by moving through the market at a pace that allowed for conversation rather than rushing from point to point. She spoke to the wife of one of the neighboring ranchers near the butcher's stall. She spoke to a man named Caldwell who operated a grain storage facility and who had, it turned out, received an approach from Voss's holding company 6 months ago that he declined without understanding fully why it made him uneasy. She spoke to the clerk at the post office, a younger woman named Sella who was friendly and openly sympathetic and who had a talent for moving information through a community that Delaney recognized immediately as valuable. Not everyone was receptive. 2 women crossed the street to avoid her line of path, which she noted without reacting to. A man named Prescott, who she learned later was connected to one of Voss's business associates, made a comment to someone beside him that was designed to carry something about women who arrived somewhere with nothing and found their way quickly into men's affairs. She heard it. She kept walking. Cole was at her side for some of it and at a distance for other parts, and she'd understood from the beginning that his presence served 2 purposes. It showed the community that the relationship was straightforward and open, and it communicated that the stories about her had not changed his position. For a man of Cole's standing in the county, 12 years at Blackthorn, known as honest and reliable, said that signal mattered. At midday, they ate at the counter of a small restaurant near the hotel, and Cole said quietly, without preamble, "Alderman wants to meet Monday." Good news or bad? The counter registration is in solid shape, he said, but Alderman's heard something from a contact at the county office. Voss has a relationship with Commissioner Bragg that goes back further than anyone realized. Bragg has been approving procedural items related to the water survey without the usual review. So he's got someone inside the county process, she said. Has had for at least 2 years, apparently. Cole set down his coffee cup. Alderman thinks we need to document Bragg's procedural approvals and show a pattern. If we can demonstrate that the survey and the contestation were processed improperly, it changes the nature of the legal argument. That's bigger than a water rights filing, she said. Yes. That's asking a lawyer to take on a county commissioner. Yes. Cole looked at her steadily. Alderman says he'll do it. He's got his own history with Bragg that motivates him. Delaney thought about this. Voss is going to know that Alderman has shifted the approach. He monitors these things. I know. Which means the next move from Voss's direction is going to come faster and be less careful than what he's done so far. She looked at the table between them for a moment. When someone like Voss feels the walls moving, he stops being methodical and starts applying pressure directly. The rumors today were careful and deniable. What comes next won't be. What do you think it looks like? She thought about her notebook, about the section she'd written most recently, the pages she'd filled in the past 2 weeks as the situation developed. He'll try to interfere directly with the legal filing, pressure on Alderman or his office, maybe an approach to witnesses, people who might testify to historical water use. He'll try to get to them before we do. She paused. And he'll make another move publicly, something designed to require Cole Mercer to spend time and resources defending his reputation rather than filing legal documents. Something against me personally, Cole said. Something against both of us, she said. That's how he'll frame it. The story about me today was the opening. The next thing will be bigger. Cole was quiet for a moment. A man and woman at the far end of the counter were having a conversation about cattle prices, and the ordinary sounds of the restaurant moved around them. Then Cole said, "Are you afraid?" It was a direct question, and she gave it the direct answer it deserved. "Yes," she said. But being afraid of something and being stopped by it are different things. He looked at her for a moment with that quiet, full attention look she'd come to recognize. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to know if you were telling me the truth about the rest of it, or managing me." "I'm always telling you the truth," she said. "I don't have the energy to manage people." He almost smiled again. This time it lasted a half-second longer before it settled back into his usual expression. "Good," he said. "I need the truth more than I need to feel better about it." "I know you do," she said. "That's why I'm still telling it to you about." They drove back to Blackthorn in the late afternoon. The wagon loaded with supplies, the sky going orange and red over the western ridge, in the particular extravagance of Colorado winter sunsets that seemed to have no relationship to the harshness of the days they ended. Hennessy drove. Delaney sat in the wagon bed with her back against a sack of flour, and Cole sat beside her, not quite touching, both of them facing the receding view of Oakhurst in the distance. She was tired. Not the simple tired of physical work, which she was used to and which sat in the body like something earned, but the particular exhaustion of having been visible and careful and controlled for several hours in a row, of performing steadiness when steadiness had required effort. She thought about the woman who had crossed the street to avoid her, about Prescott's comment, designed to carry, about the way some people had looked at her in that assessing, slightly contemptuous way that she'd been looked at her whole life, the frontier woman who didn't fit decoratively, who knew too much and said it, who was in places and situations where the conventional wisdom said she had no business being. She was used to it. You became used to things that happened repeatedly, but used to it didn't mean it didn't register. It registered every time, just briefly, before she set it aside and continued, because continuing was the only option she'd ever found workable. "You did well today," Cole said beside her. He said it quietly, facing forward, not making a moment of it. "I said true things to people who were willing to hear them," she said. "That's the baseline. It's not impressive." "It is, actually," he said. "Most people can't do it. The saying true things part is easy enough. It's the part where you do it while someone else is actively working to undermine you in real time. That's the hard part." She looked at the side of his face. He was watching the road ahead, the familiar reins of the return journey, the landscape he'd ridden across so many times. It was probably visible when he closed his eyes. "I learned it the hard way," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it real rather than performed." She looked back at the receding town. Somewhere in Oakhurst or Ridgeback, Harlan Voss was making calculations. She could picture his office, the portrait on the wall, Garrett at his desk in the outer room. She could picture the way he'd received the news that his planted story had been met publicly, that Cole Mercer had been seen in town alongside the woman he'd been expected to distance himself from by now. She knew what that news would produce. She'd written it in the notebook, in the section she hadn't shown Cole yet, in the page headed "When the First Phase Fails." The wagon rolled on. The sunset went from orange to a dark, bruised red, and then to the gray-blue of early evening, and the first stars came out over the ridge. At the ranch, the kitchen would be cold and would need the range lit. The crew would need supper. The dishes would need washing, and the morning prep would need to start, and there were 100 small, ongoing, necessary things that formed the structure of this place she'd come to against her will, and found herself, improbably, unwilling to see destroyed. She'd arrived with nothing worth counting. She wasn't leaving the same way. The wagon came down off the ridge into the valley, and the lights of Blackthorn Ranch appeared below them, small and steady and warm against the darkening ground. The letter arrived on a Monday, addressed to Cole Mercer, in care of Blackthorn Ranch, written on county stationery and signed by Commissioner Bragg. It informed Cole that as a result of the ongoing water rights contestation, and in accordance with county land use protocols, a formal hearing had been scheduled for the third week of December. At the hearing, Cole would be required to demonstrate lawful and exclusive historical use of the Eastern Creek. Failure to appear or to provide sufficient documentation would result in the creek being reclassified as a public waterway under county jurisdiction. 3 weeks. That was what Bragg had given them. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table while Delaney stood across from him, and when he finished, he set it flat on the table and looked at it the way a man looks at something he expected and still isn't glad to see. "He's accelerating," Delaney said. 3 weeks isn't enough time to build a full historical record," Cole said. "Alderman told me a proper filing like this takes 6 to 8 weeks minimum." "That's why Bragg scheduled it in 3. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "The timeline isn't procedural. It's a weapon. He wants you scrambling instead of building a clean case." Cole pushed the letter slightly away from him. "Alderman needs to know today." "Yes. And there's something else." She'd been thinking about this since the moment she'd watched Cole's face while reading, the particular calculation running behind his eyes, the same one that had been running behind hers since Saturday's return from Oakhurst. The hearing is a public proceeding. That's the thing Voss may not have fully accounted for. Cole looked up at her. "Go on." He's used closed processes his whole career. The loan agreements, the debt transfers, the county filings. All of it happens in offices between people who control the paperwork. But a public hearing means witnesses, testimony, documentation that becomes part of the county record and can be examined by anyone. She leaned forward slightly. If aldermen can shift the hearing scope from just the water rights question to the process by which the contestation was filed, Bragg's approvals, the timeline of Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust's filings, then the hearing becomes something Voss didn't intend it to be. Cole was quiet, thinking it through. Alderman mentioned that the pattern of approvals could constitute procedural misconduct, he said slowly. Misconduct that happened inside a county office, she said, which is exactly the kind of thing a public hearing can surface, if someone comes prepared to surface it. That's asking aldermen to walk into a room where Bragg is both opponent and judge. Bragg runs the hearing, but he doesn't control what witnesses say under it, she said. And if other parties attend, other ranchers, merchants, anyone withstanding to speak to how Voss's operations have affected this county, Bragg can't simply rule them out of order without it looking like exactly what it is. Cole held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him weighing it, turning the angles, looking for the places where it could fail, which was how he made decisions, and she'd learned not to rush him through that part. Caldwell, Cole said finally. The grain man. You said he'd been approached by Voss's holding company. He declined it, and it bothered him. He's the right kind of bothered, the kind that's looking for a place to put it. Margaret Hale's husband sits on the Merchants' Council. He does. And you said Sella at the post office knows everyone and talks to everyone and is not inclined toward Voss, Delaney confirmed. She's not a legal witness, but she's a relay point. If people need to know about the hearing, she'll know how to make sure the right ones do. Cole stood up, picked up the letter, folded it. I'm going to Oakhurst to see Alderman today, he said. I want you to come. All right, not just as a second pair of ears, he said. I want you in the room when Alderman and I talk strategy. You understand Voss's methods better than anyone at that table. She looked at him. He said it flatly, matter-of-factly, the way he said things he considered obvious. She had learned by now that Cole Mercer's obvious and other men's obvious were not always the same category, and that his particular version of obvious tended to include things that other men would have considered debatable. All right, she said again. Again. Alderman's office smelled like paper and cold pipe tobacco, and the specific staleness of a room where important and unpleasant things were regularly discussed. He was a compact man in his early 50s with a precise manner and a personal history with Bragg that he'd alluded to but never fully explained, which Delaney had concluded meant it was significant enough to matter and painful enough that he didn't volunteer it. He read Bragg's letter twice. His expression didn't change much, but his stillness increased, which, in Delaney's experience, meant the same thing as another man's visible anger. 3 weeks, he said. Is it actionable? Cole said. The timeline. It's aggressive, and it's at the edge of procedural legitimacy, Alderman said, which is exactly where Bragg likes to operate. Close enough to legal that challenging it costs you resources and time you could be using otherwise. He set the letter on his desk. The question is whether we fight the timeline or use it. Use it, Delaney said. Both men looked at her. She'd been sitting slightly back from the primary conversation, which was where she'd positioned herself deliberately. Close enough to contribute, distant enough not to take over a room she'd been invited into as a resource, not a principal. She leaned forward now. If we challenge the timeline, we spend 2 of our 3 weeks on a procedural argument that Bragg will deny and that costs Alderman time he should be spending on the substance, she said. But if we accept the timeline and use those 3 weeks to build the strongest possible public presentation, we go into that hearing ready to surface things Voss didn't expect to be surfaced. Alderman looked at her with the slightly recalibrating expression of a man who had expected to be managing Cole's instincts and was finding the situation more complicated than that. What things specifically? He said. Bragg's approval history on Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust filings, she said. Commissioner Bragg's role in approving each step of this process is a matter of county record. If those approvals were processed outside normal review channels, that's documentable. And if it's documented and presented at a public hearing, Bragg is in the position of having to explain his own conduct while simultaneously running the proceeding. Alderman was quiet for a moment. That's a significant thing to put before a public hearing. Voss has been doing significant things in closed rooms for years, she said. The public hearing is the first open room this has happened in. That changes the rules. Alderman looked at Cole. Your cook, he said, not unkindly, is either going to win this for us or give Voss grounds for a harassment claim. She's right, Cole said simply. Alderman picked up his pen. Tell me specifically what you know about the approval timeline, he said to Delaney. Everything, from the first survey inquiry forward. She told him. She'd written it down, which meant she could deliver it in order and with specificity, which was the form a lawyer needed. She walked him through the 8-month progression from the initial survey filing to the formal contestation to Bragg's accelerated hearing notice, laying out the dates, the entities, the procedural steps that had moved unusually quickly. Alderman wrote and asked questions. Cole added what he could from the deed records and the grandfather's correspondence. By the end of the hour, the desk between them was covered in Alderman's notes. I need a week to pull the county records, Alderman said. The approval documents are public, but accessing them requires a formal request, and I want to do that quietly so Bragg doesn't know what we're building until we're in the room. He looked at both of them. In the meantime, I need your witnesses. Anyone who can testify to historical water use on Blackthorn Creek, anyone who has had dealings with Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust or Voss's holding companies, anyone with direct knowledge of how Bragg's office has handled these filings. I can have a list by Thursday, Delaney said. Good. Alderman capped his pen. Miss Crowe, I want to say something directly. She waited. The stories circulating about you in this county concern me from a legal standpoint, he said. Not because I believe them, because opposing counsel, if Voss engages one formally, may attempt to use your presence in this case to redirect the hearing's focus. You should be prepared for that. I've been prepared for it since before the story started, she said. That's why I went to Oakhurst on Saturday rather than avoiding it. He studied her. Yes, he said. That was the right instinct. He paused. It was also, if you'll forgive me, somewhat courageous. It was necessary, she said. Courage and necessity are often the same thing. The week that followed was the hardest kind of week, the kind where important things were happening in offices and legal processes that you couldn't directly control, and the only available response was to do the things within your reach as well as possible and wait. Delaney was not constitutionally suited to waiting, but she'd learned over the years that the waiting itself could be used, that the gap between action and outcome was where preparation happened if you were doing it right. She built the witness list. She went back to Oakhurst twice, once to speak with Caldwell and once to follow up with Margaret Hale, whose husband turned out to have more direct information about Bragg's relationship with Voss's holding company than she'd expected. Specifically, that Bragg had attended a private dinner at Voss's Ridgeback estate 6 months before the first Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust filing. A dinner that had not appeared in any public record, but that Hale had heard about from a man who'd worked the catering for it. That detail went into the notebook and from the notebook to Alderman, who received it with the controlled satisfaction of a man adding a piece to a structure he was building carefully. Rooster made contact with 2 former hands from the Ferris operation near Cedar Flat, the ranch Voss had absorbed 2 years earlier. Both men were willing to describe what they'd observed in the months before the Ferris family lost the property. Neither was eager to put themselves in a room with Bragg and Voss's interests, and Delaney understood that, and she told them both the same thing she'd come to believe about the situation, that the alternative to being in a room where Voss was present was being in a world where Voss had already won, and that the second option was more uncomfortable than the first. One of them, a man named Garrity, said he'd come to the hearing. The other said he'd think about it, which meant probably not, but she added his name to the list anyway. Dex rode out to 2 neighboring ranches to the north and spoke to their owners about the water rights situation, explaining what a county reclassification of the creek would mean for the valley's water access more broadly. One ranch owner said he'd already been considering exactly this and had been waiting to see which way the wind was blowing. The other said he couldn't afford to get involved in something that might bring Voss's attention to his operation, which was a legitimate fear, and Delaney didn't argue with it. Cole did the thing Delaney had described to Rooster weeks earlier, the communicating, not just managing. He rode out himself to speak with people, which was not his habit, and which cost him something, she could see, because Cole Mercer was a man who preferred to work through action rather than conversation. But he did it, and the doing of it imperfectly. The slight awkwardness of a self-contained man asking for support was probably more convincing than polished advocacy would have been. 6 days before the hearing, Voss made the move Delaney had predicted. It came through the county sheriff's office, which gave it the weight of official process while maintaining deniability for Voss himself. A deputy rode out to Blackthorn with a document, not an arrest, nothing so direct, but a formal inquiry into Delaney Crowe's residency status at the ranch, citing an anonymous complaint that a person of disputed financial history was residing on the property in circumstances that raised questions of impropriety, and requesting that Cole Mercer provide documentation of the employment arrangement and confirm that county vagrancy ordinances were being observed. The deputy was young and clearly uncomfortable with his errand. He handed the document to Cole on the front porch of the ranch house and didn't quite meet his eyes. Cole read it. His face was controlled, but Delaney, standing behind him slightly, saw the muscle in his jaw. "Who filed the complaint?" Cole said. "The inquiry was filed anonymously, sir," the deputy said. "With the county sheriff's office." "Yes, sir. And the sheriff accepted an anonymous complaint against a specific named individual residing on private property." The deputy shifted his weight. "I'm just delivering the document, Mr. Mercer." "I understand." Cole's voice was level and careful. "You'll tell the sheriff that Miss Crowe is employed at this ranch as cook, that her employment arrangement is documented and above reproach, and that I consider this inquiry an improper use of county process that I intend to raise formally at the upcoming hearing." He folded the document. "You can also tell him that if this is the best that can be done with county resources, the voters in this district might have thoughts about that come election year." The deputy's discomfort deepened. He was, Delaney thought, a young man who had taken a job and found himself inside a situation considerably larger than the job had seemed when he signed for it. After he rode away, Cole turned to her. He held out the folded document. "This is going to Alderman today," he said. "Yes," she said. "This is actually better for us than it is for him. Anonymous complaints processed through the sheriff's office against a named private citizen. That's exactly the kind of thing that looks like what it is when it's laid beside the other filings in a public record. It's also designed to humiliate you," Cole said. He said it directly, without softening it, because he'd learned that she preferred the direct version. "Yes," she said. "That's its secondary purpose. The primary purpose is to force us to spend time and energy on a response rather than on hearing preparation." Cole looked at her steadily. "Are you all right?" She considered the question honestly rather than reflexively. "I'm angry," she said, "and I'm tired in a specific way that comes from being the instrument someone keeps reaching for. But I'm not broken by it, if that's what you're asking." "That's what I was asking." "Then I'm all right," she said. "Let's get the document to Alderman." The morning of the hearing arrived cold and still, the kind of winter morning where sound carries further than it should, where the creak of the wagon and the breath of the horses and the sound of boots on frozen ground all seem too loud. Cole and Delaney drove to Oakhurst with Rooster and Dex, leaving Pip and the remaining hands to manage the ranch. Hennessy had gone in the day before with the supply wagon and, had Delaney suspected, spent the intervening time in conversation with people she'd asked him to speak to. The county meeting hall in Oakhurst held perhaps 60 people standing, and it was holding more than that by the time they arrived. Delaney had not anticipated this exactly, had hoped for it, had worked toward it, but hope and reality were different things, and she'd trained herself not to assume they'd match. They matched. Caldwell was there, seated near the front with two of his business associates. Margaret Hale and her husband occupied seats mid-hall. Garrity, the former Ferris Ranch hand who'd said he would come, was there. And beside him was the second man, the one who'd said he'd think about it, which meant something had shifted for him in the intervening days, and Delaney made a mental note to find out what. The rancher from the north who'd been watching which way the wind blew had apparently decided. Sella from the post office was there, which was not legally significant, but was socially significant, because Sella's presence communicated something about where the town's sentiment was sitting. There were also people Delaney didn't recognize, county residents, she assumed, who had their own reasons for attending. That was the nature of public proceedings. They attracted anyone with a stake. And in a county where Voss had been operating for a decade, the number of people with a stake was larger than he may have calculated. Voss himself arrived with two men Delaney didn't know, and his attorney, a sharp-suited man from Denver, who was visibly assessing the room with the particular efficiency of a professional who'd walked into situations like this before. Voss's expression, when he saw the attendants, was controlled. But Delaney had been watching his face for years from a distance, and she caught the brief recalibration, a fraction of a second where the room was not what he'd expected, and he was adjusting. Commissioner Bragg called the hearing to order. He was a heavy man in his 60s with the well-exercised authority of someone who'd run county proceedings long enough to believe the room belonged to him by right. He explained the purpose of the hearing in the brisk, conclusory language of a man who expected it to be brief. Alderman rose first. He was precise and unhurried, presenting the counter-registration documentation with the methodical care of someone who had organized it to be impossible to dismiss efficiently. He laid out Blackthorn's historical water use across 3 decades of records, correspondence, and sworn testimony. He was thorough in a way that required time, and time was something Bragg had been counting on not having. When Voss's Denver attorney rose to contest the sufficiency of the documentation, Alderman was ready. He introduced the timeline of Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust's filings alongside the record of Bragg's approval dates for each step, and he asked, in the measured language of a man who knew exactly how the question would land, whether the commissioner would clarify the standard review process for such filings and explain how the contestation had moved from initial inquiry to formal hearing in a timeline that appeared inconsistent with that standard. The room was quiet in the particular way of people who understood they were watching something real happen. Bragg said the process had been conducted properly, and Alderman thanked him for confirming that, and then presented documentation showing that the standard review process for water rights contestations in Mesa County required a minimum 60-day consideration period between filing and formal hearing scheduling, and that the current hearing had been scheduled in 19 days. The quiet in the room changed quality. Bragg's attorney, because Bragg had, it emerged, engaged his own legal representation, which itself was notable, objected to the scope of the inquiry. Alderman pointed out that the scope had been established by the hearing's own notice and that he was responding to it. Caldwell testified to being approached by Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust under representations that had proven inconsistent with the company's actual structure. Garrity described what he'd observed in the months before the Ferris Ranch changed hands. Hale's husband spoke to a pattern of county approvals that had consistently favored Voss-connected interests across 3 years of Merchants Council observation. Voss's attorney objected frequently. Bragg sustained some of the objections and overruled others, and the ones he overruled were the ones that mattered, which suggested to Delaney that Bragg was performing authority for the room while recognizing privately that the room had become something he could no longer control through procedural mechanics alone. It was not a clean or triumphant proceeding. Alderman was challenged repeatedly. 2 of the witnesses stumbled under cross-examination and had to be guided back to what they actually knew rather than what they were inferring. The Denver attorney was skilled, and he found real gaps in the documentation, moments where the chain of evidence had links that were thinner than Delaney would have liked. At one point, Bragg called a 15-minute recess that stretched to 30, and when he returned, his demeanor had shifted in a way that made Delaney think someone had spoken to him during it, though she could not determine who. But the documentation was what it was. The approval dates were public record, and Alderman had them, and they said what they said regardless of how the Denver attorney framed them. The witnesses were imperfect, but their imperfections were the imperfections of real people with real memory, which was more convincing to a room full of neighbors than polished testimony would have been. By the end of the afternoon, Bragg had not ruled. He announced that he would take the documentation under advisement and issue a decision within 10 days. 10 days instead of today was not a victory, but it was not a loss either, and in the specific calculus of fighting someone like Voss, not losing was a different thing from what it sounded like. Not losing meant the water rights remained in their current status. Not losing meant the documentation was now in the public record. Not losing meant that Voss's process, for the first time, had been examined publicly and found to contain questions it couldn't immediately answer. They walked out of the county hall into the cold evening air. Alderman walked beside Cole, speaking quietly about what came next. Delaney fell into step slightly behind them, Rooster at her side. "That was something," Rooster said. It was a beginning, she said. You don't look satisfied. I'm not unsatisfied, she said carefully. I know it's not finished. He doesn't lose in one afternoon. It's going to take more than this. Rooster was quiet for a step or two. But it's different now, he said. The room saw it. She looked ahead to where Cole was walking, the set of his shoulders, the particular way he carried a hard day. Straight but not rigid. The posture of a man who'd spent energy on something that mattered and was still standing. Yes, she said. It's different now. Across the street, she saw Voss getting into his carriage. He didn't look at her. That was a choice, she knew. The deliberate not looking of a man who understood that looking would communicate something he wasn't ready to communicate. But the not looking was its own kind of acknowledgement, and she stood on the street corner and watched his carriage until it turned at the far end of the block and moved out of sight. The cold had settled fully into the town. Her breath came out in small visible clouds. She was tired in a way that went all the way down, into the bones and below them, the deep grain exhaustion of months of vigilance and preparation, and the specific strain of making people see something true when another person was working to obscure it. But the room had seen it. She turned and walked toward the wagon where the others were gathering, pulling her coat tighter against the dark, and she thought, not finished, not close to finished, but the tide had moved, and the man who'd counted on it moving only in one direction was learning something tonight that she'd learned years ago at far greater cost. The truth, once it was in the room, was harder to clear out than people expected. Bragg's decision came on the 9th day, which was one day earlier than his stated deadline and therefore surprised everyone, including Alderman, who received the county document at his office and rode out to Blackthorn personally rather than sending a messenger. Delaney saw him coming from the kitchen window and knew from the pace of his horse that it wasn't bad news. Bad news arrived either very fast or very slow, and this was something in between, the pace of a man carrying something complicated that leaned toward good. She had the coffee ready when he came through the door. Cole read the decision at the kitchen table with Alderman across from him and Delaney to his right. The document was dense with legal language, but the operative section was clear enough. Commissioner Bragg had declined to reclassify the Eastern Creek as a public waterway, citing insufficient evidence that Blackthorn Ranch's historical use had operated in legal ambiguity. The water rights contestation filed by Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust was dismissed without prejudice, meaning it could theoretically be refiled, but only under materially different circumstances. There was a second section. It was shorter and more carefully worded, and it stated that the county would be conducting an internal review of the procedures by which the original survey inquiry and subsequent contestation had been processed, in order to ensure compliance with established county timelines and review standards. Cole set the document down. He was quiet for a moment. Bragg ruled against Voss, he said. Not a question, more the sound of a man confirming something to himself. He ruled against the filing, Alderman said carefully. Bragg is a politician, and politicians respond to rooms. The room at that hearing was not what he'd planned for. The internal review language is his way of separating himself from the process before anyone does it for him. He's covering himself, Delaney said. Efficiently, Alderman said, which is its own form of useful. An internal review, even a self-protective one, creates a paper trail. Whatever that review finds becomes part of the county record. Cole looked at Delaney. She was looking at the document, reading the second section again, thinking through what it meant in sequence rather than in isolation. She'd learned not to celebrate things before she understood their full shape. Is it over? Cole asked her directly. She considered it honestly. The water rights are protected for now, she said. The internal review, if it goes anywhere real, is going to make Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust's filing history very uncomfortable for anyone connected to it. Voss's next move in this county is going to cost him more than it would have 6 months ago, because now there's a public record of how he operates, and people who've spoken against him on that record. She paused. It's not over the way a door closing is over. It's over the way a tide turns. Things move differently after this. Alderman nodded. That's accurate? Cole was quiet again. Then he looked at Alderman. What do I owe you? Alderman named the figure. Cole wrote him a bank draft without expression, though Delaney knew what it cost him against the winter reserves, and Alderman took it and stood to leave. At the kitchen door he turned. Miss Crowe? He said. The witness preparation, the timeline documentation, The approach in Oakhurst before the hearing, that work was significant. I want you to know that. The work needed doing, she said. Most work that needs doing doesn't get done this well, he said. Good morning to you both. He rode away. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Pip was doing something noisy with a fence tool in the yard, and the sound of it was ordinary and good. Cole put both hands flat on the table and looked at them for a moment, the posture of a man releasing something he'd been holding for a long time. It's going to be a hard winter financially, he said. Yes, she said. I'll need to adjust the supply schedule. Some things will have to wait until spring. I know. I've already started looking at where to cut without affecting the crew's meals. He looked up at her. There was something in his face that had been there increasingly over the past weeks, but which he'd been careful with, keeping it in the background, managing it with the same deliberate control he managed everything. She'd noticed it the way she noticed most things at Blackthorn, quietly, without announcing the noticing. You've been doing that already, he said, planning for the lean months. Someone had to think about it, she said. You've had other things occupying you. You've had the same other things. I've also had a kitchen to run, she said. It keeps my hands busy and my head in the practical. That helps me. He nodded slowly. He was still looking at her with that thing in his face. Delaney, he said. She waited. I don't know how to say this the right way, he said, which was more words of preface than she'd heard him use for anything. So I'm going to say it plainly, and you can tell me if I've read the situation wrong. All right, she said. You came here as the cook, he said. That's what I hired you for. That's what you've been. But somewhere in the past 4 months, you also became the person I think most clearly with, the person I want in the room when things are difficult, the person whose judgment I trust above anyone else's on this ranch. He paused. That's not a description of an employee. I'm not entirely sure what it's a description of, but I know it's not that. The kitchen was very still. Through the window, Pip's fence tool sounds continued, oblivious. I'm not asking you to stop being the cook, Cole said. I'm not asking you to be anything you're not. I'm asking if I can court you properly. Take my time about it. Do it right. Not because I think you need the formality, but because you deserve the respect of being asked rather than assumed. She looked at him. He was watching her with the steady, undefended directness that was his specific form of courage, a man who did not perform feelings but was fully present inside them when they arrived. She thought about what she'd believed about herself a year ago, standing in Harlan Voss's office in Ridgeback, with $11 and a legal argument and nothing else. She thought about what she'd believed about herself on the road to Blackthorn, walking on blistered feet through the cold prairie, telling herself that all she needed was a job and a room and a purpose, that needing anything beyond the practical was a luxury she'd stopped being able to afford. She'd been wrong about that. She recognized it now, sitting at this table, which had become her table in the way that this kitchen had become her kitchen, and this ranch had become something she couldn't walk away from without it costing her something real. You haven't read it wrong, she said. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something open and slightly unguarded. A man who'd asked a difficult thing and gotten an answer he'd hoped for but hadn't assumed. Then he nodded, once in that way of his that meant a decision made and settled. Good, he said. And then, because he was Cole Mercer and not a man given to extended emotional performance, I'll let you get back to the kitchen. She almost laughed. Not at him, but at the rightness of it. The way the moment had been what it needed to be without being more than that, which was how the important things seemed to happen when they happened honestly. Go check the north fence, she said. Pip's been at it for an hour, and he's doing it wrong. He took his hat and went. That's the word about Bragg's decision moved through the county the way significant things moved in small communities, faster than could be fully explained by normal channels, as if the information itself had somewhere to be. By the following Saturday, the shape of what had happened at the hearing was common knowledge in Oakhurst, including the parts that hadn't been in Bragg's formal decision, including the questions about Mesa Valley Agricultural Trust and the approval timeline that the internal review would now need to address. Voss did not respond publicly. That silence was its own statement, the silence of a man calculating rather than reacting, which meant he was not finished, but he was injured. His position in the county diminished in ways he would need time to assess. Delaney knew enough about him to know he would not simply stop. He would wait, adjust, look for another angle, But the angle would cost more now, and he would need to find it in a county where people had spoken against him on the public record, and where any new filing from a Voss-connected entity would be examined with the specific attention that scrutiny brings once it's been activated. That was the thing about exposure. Once the light was on, it stayed on. You couldn't unilluminate something. Margaret Hale sent a note to Blackthorne, a brief, practical note in neat handwriting, saying that she'd spoken to 3 families in the district who had old dealings with Voss, and that 2 of them were interested in speaking with aldermen about what they knew. She wrote it in the businesslike tone of a woman who did not make a production of doing the right thing, which was the kind Delaney had the most respect for. Garrity, the former Ferris ranch hand who had testified, stopped by Blackthorne a week after the hearing. He wasn't looking for thanks. He said so directly, which Delaney appreciated, but he wanted to know what the internal review was likely to find. Whatever was in Bragg's approval records, she told him, which means whatever he approved outside standard review, that's going to tell its own story. Will anything actually happen to Bragg? She was honest about it. I don't know. Politicians protect themselves with paperwork and procedure. He may find a way to make the internal review point somewhere else. She paused. But the Ferris family situation is in aldermen's files now. If they want to pursue something, there's a foundation. Garrity thought about that. I'll tell them, he said. Do that, she said. She watched him ride away and thought about justice, which was a thing she'd stopped expecting to arrive cleanly or completely a long time ago. Justice, in her experience, was rarely the dramatic settling of accounts that people imagined. It was more often a slow accumulation of consequences, small things that compounded, records that persisted, reputations that shifted over time until the man who'd seemed untouchable found himself operating in a narrower space than before, with fewer allies and more eyes on him and less room to maneuver. That wasn't satisfaction exactly, but it was something real, and real was what she'd learned to value over the dramatic version that life almost never delivered. 8. Winter settled hard over the Blackthorne Valley in January, the kind that locked the high passes and kept the ranch operating inward, focused on itself. The financial tightness Cole had anticipated was real. The legal costs had cut the reserves to a point where some of the planned equipment purchases had to wait, and the supply runs to Oakhurst were fewer and more deliberate. Delaney stretched the provisions with the methodical creativity she'd been developing her whole life, the skill of making a limited pantry feel like abundance through rotation and attention, and the kind of cooking that treated basics as the starting point rather than the limitation. The crew didn't complain. She wasn't sure if that was because they didn't notice or because they trusted her to handle it, and eventually she concluded it was probably both and that both were fine. Cole took to eating at the kitchen table in the evenings after the crew had finished, which had started as a practical convenience. He often had paperwork that needed the table's surface, and had evolved into something neither of them had explicitly decided on. He worked on his papers. She worked on whatever the kitchen needed after supper. They talked, sometimes about the ranch, sometimes about other things, sometimes not much at all. The silences were comfortable in the way that silences between people become comfortable when both of them are settled enough in each other's company not to need the gaps filled. He told her about his wife one evening in February, which he hadn't done before and which she hadn't asked about. Not because she wasn't curious, she was, but because she'd understood from the beginning that it was something he'd come to in his own time or not at all, and asking would have changed the nature of whatever he eventually chose to offer. Her name had been Clara. She'd died 4 years ago, a winter illness that had moved quickly and that Cole had not been able to do anything about, which was the part that had cost him the most. He said it plainly, without self-pity or dramatizing, the way he said most things. But she could hear what was underneath the plainness, the specific grief of a man who'd spent years afterward keeping everything orderly and controlled because the one thing he hadn't been able to control had taken the person he loved. She didn't say anything that was designed to make it better because there wasn't anything designed for that purpose. She said, "She sounds like someone who made things real around her," because that was what she'd gathered from the way he lived and ran the ranch and treated the people on it. He looked at her across the table. "That's a good way to describe her," he said, quietly, like she'd found something he hadn't had the words for. "I'm sorry you lost her," she said. "I'm sorry you lost your father the way you did," he said, "before you'd had enough time." She thought about Thomas Crowe and his cramped handwriting in the final pages of the journal, and the entries she'd read in this same ranch's small, dark room in her first nights here. She'll be all right. We both lost people to hard circumstances, she said, and kept going anyway. Keeping going is the whole of it sometimes, he said. Sometimes, she agreed, and sometimes it turns into something else. He looked at her. The lamp on the table between them was low, the kind of light that makes a room feel contained and honest. Yes, he said. It does. Spring came the way Colorado springs do, grudgingly, in stages, with several false starts and at least one late snowfall that came in March and threatened the early garden work Pip had started under Delaney's direction. They salvaged most of it by covering the beds with canvas for 3 days, which required getting up before light, and was cold, miserable work that Pip did without significant complaint, and that Delaney did beside him, because she didn't believe in asking people to do things she wasn't willing to do herself. This is the worst part of gardening, Pip said on the second morning, his breath coming out in visible clouds over the canvas-draped beds. It is, she agreed. Then why do it? Because in August you'll have tomatoes, she said, and you'll know you kept them alive through March. He considered this. That's a long way to wait for a tomato. Most worthwhile things are a long way to wait for. He was quiet for a moment, tucking the canvas edge down against the cold ground. Then, are you and Mr. Mercer? He stopped, started again. I mean, are you? Pip, she said. Yeah. Finish a sentence or don't start it. He looked up. He was pink from the cold and slightly embarrassed, but he pushed through it with the directness of a young man who'd decided to ask something. Are you going to stay? At Blackthorn, long term. She sat back on her heels and looked at the canvas-covered beds, and beyond them at the ranch in the early gray light, the barns and the bunkhouse and the main house with its kitchen window that she'd stood at more mornings than she could count now. Yes, she said. I'm going to stay. Pip nodded, satisfied in the uncomplicated way of a 20-year-old who'd gotten the answer he'd wanted. Good, he said. The food's better. She laughed. A real one. The kind that surprised her slightly. Thank you, Pip. I meant it as a compliment. I know you did. That's why it is one. Yeah. The formal courtship, as Cole had called it, was not formal in any way that Ridgeback or Oakhurst would have recognized. It looked mostly like two people who had been working and talking and being honest with each other for months, continuing to do those things with a different understanding between them. Cole did not bring flowers, which she would have found disconcerting, but he did start asking her opinion on ranch decisions that went beyond her immediate domain, purchasing choices, pasture management questions, whether to expand the cattle operation in the fall. He asked the way he'd asked her about Voss's legal maneuvering, directly, expecting a real answer, ready to be disagreed with. She gave him real answers. She disagreed with him sometimes. He pushed back when he thought she was wrong, and occasionally he was right, and she told him so. And occasionally she was right, and he told her so. And the whole of it had the texture of two adults who respected each other enough to skip the performance. In April, Alderman sent a letter. The county's internal review had produced findings that implicated Bragg in procedural violations across 5 separate filings over 3 years, all connected to Voss-associated entities. Bragg had resigned the commissioner's seat rather than face a formal censure hearing. A new commissioner would be appointed by the district in the summer. Cole read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Delaney without comment. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the far wall of the kitchen for a moment. Bragg resigned, Cole said. Yes, that's more than I expected. More than I expected, too, she said honestly. Politicians usually manage to stay inside the lines. He must not have been as careful as he thought. Or the review was more thorough than he expected. Or both. She looked at the letter again. It won't undo what he did to the Ferris family. Or to mine. The damage is already in the past and it doesn't get retrieved. No, Cole said. It doesn't. She pushed the letter back toward him. But the next person Voss approaches in this county is going to find a different landscape than the one my father found in Ridgeback. That's worth something. It might be worth enough. Cole looked at her steadily. Does it give you anything, personally? She thought about it, actually thought about it rather than answering from the first feeling that surfaced. There was something, not satisfaction exactly, more like a settling, the way a load-bearing structure relaxes slightly when pressure that's been applied to it is removed. Not vindication, because vindication implied that the loss had been made right, and the loss couldn't be made right. Her father was still dead. His land was still in Voss's portfolio. The years between that Tuesday morning and this April kitchen were what they were. But she was here. And here had become something. "It gives me something," she said. "It's not everything, but it's something real." He nodded. He understood the difference between those two things because he was a man who'd lived with the difference between them for years himself. The spring cattle drive in May required all hands and 2 weeks of work that pushed everyone to their limits. The kind of sustained effort that strips away whatever social arrangement a group of people has been maintaining and shows the actual structure underneath. What showed at Blackthorn was not complicated. 7 people who had decided in their various ways and for their various reasons that this place mattered enough to put themselves into it completely. Rooster managed the drive with the weathered competence of a man who had done this particular thing so many times that his body knew it without requiring his conscious attention. Dex pushed himself past sensible limits in the way of young men who haven't yet learned that recovery takes longer than the exertion, and Delaney made him a compress for his shoulder on the 6th day and told him to stop favoring his left side before he made it permanent. He did, mostly. Pip handled the remuda with a steadiness that hadn't been there when she'd first watched him attempt to repair a gate latch with the wrong gauge wire, and she noticed the change without remarking on it, because remarking on growth tends to make people self-conscious about it. Cole drove alongside his crew, which was the only way he knew how to lead, and which was, Delaney had concluded, probably the most important single fact about why Blackthorn functioned the way it did. Not a man who managed from a distance, who kept his hands clean and his boots shined while others did the hard work. A man who arrived in the same mud as everyone else and expected the same of himself that he expected of them. She cooked from the chuck wagon, which was not her favorite context for cooking. The limitations were real and the conditions were not ideal. But she made it work through the same combination of planning and improvisation that she'd applied to every kitchen she'd ever been responsible for. On the 7th evening, sitting around the fire after supper, Rooster said, unprompted, that this was the first cattle drive in 5 years where the food hadn't been something to endure. "That's a low bar," she said. "It's an honest bar," he said. Dex said, "The biscuits at noon on day 4. I've been thinking about those biscuits. They were regular biscuits," she said. "They were the best biscuits I've had on a drive." "That's what I said, low bar." Cole was sitting across the fire from her, and she caught his expression in the firelight. That almost smile, the brief unguarded thing that she'd stopped being surprised by but hadn't stopped noticing. He caught her looking and didn't look away. She didn't either. The fire settled. The cattle were quiet in the dark beyond the camp perimeter. The sound of them a constant low presence that you stopped hearing consciously after a few days and only noticed when it stopped. The stars over the Colorado high country were the same extravagant, indifferent stars they'd always been. Pip said, "I wrote my mother about the ranch. She wrote back and said, 'It sounds like I finally found somewhere worth being.'" "Smart woman," Rooster said. "She is," Pip said. He looked at Delaney across the fire. "I told her about you, about the food and the garden and all of it." He paused. "She said any woman who could get Rooster to admit the food was good must be something exceptional." "She hasn't met Rooster," Delaney said. "The standard was low." "I'm right here," Rooster said without offense. "I know," she said. "I'm talking about you, not at you." He made a sound that was, she had learned to recognize, his version of a laugh. The formal question, the one that came after the courtship that hadn't looked like courtship, after the winter and the legal battle and the cattle drive and the months of honest conversation and disagreement and working beside each other through hard things, came on a June evening when the valley was at its best, the grass deep green and the creek running full, and the light lasting late the way it did in early summer. Cole found her in the kitchen garden, which was her habit in the late evening hours when the work of the day was largely done, but the light still held. She was staking the climbing beans against the late-season growth. He came and stood nearby, not helping. He knew she preferred to do the garden work herself, that it was one of the places she went to think, and he'd learned to respect the geography of her quiet, and waited until she was at a stopping point. "I have something to ask you," he said. She straightened. She looked at him. He was holding something, a small, plain ring, silver, no ornamentation, which was so exactly right for who he was and who she was that she felt something loosen in her chest before he'd said another word. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I know," she said. "I know you came here with nothing and built something from it on your own terms," he said. "I know you don't need anyone to give you a life. You make your own life. That's not why I'm asking." He paused, organizing the words with the same deliberate care he organized everything. "I'm asking because the life I have is better with you in it. Not just useful or convenient, better. And I'd like to stop treating that as a temporary arrangement." She looked at him in the late light. She thought about the road from Ridgeback, the blistered feet, and the $11, and the stubborn refusal to lie down inside a loss and call it the end. She thought about the first morning in this kitchen, the sourdough biscuits and the crew's expressions, and the particular satisfaction of doing a thing well in a room that needed it done. She thought about her father's journal and the cramped handwriting, and she'll be all right, and she thought that he'd known something she hadn't known yet about what all right could eventually mean. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. It fit, imperfectly, a little loose. It would need adjusting, which seemed right, because things that fit exactly without adjustment were usually things that weren't real. He held her hand for a moment, both of them standing in the kitchen garden in the June light, with the creek sound in the distance, and the beans staked neatly against their frames. Then he said, "Supper was good tonight." She laughed, the same surprised, real laugh from the conversation with Pip in the cold March morning. "That's what you're going with." "It was," he said. "The gravy especially." "Cole." "Yes?" "Stop talking about the gravy." He did. They married in August, quietly, at the ranch, which was the only place that made sense. Alderman came. Margaret Hale and her husband came. Caldwell came. Garrity came with his wife, a small woman from Cedar Flat, who shook Delaney's hand with a firm grip and said she'd heard about the hearing and was glad someone had finally said it out loud. Hennessy was there, which mattered. He'd settled into his role handling supply logistics with the equanimity of a man who'd found his right place after a period of adjustment, and he brought a bottle of decent whiskey that he'd apparently been saving for a specific occasion and had decided this was it. Rooster wore a clean shirt, which was the most formal gesture available to him and which he deployed with great dignity. Pip cried briefly, which he denied, and which everyone pretended not to notice. The wedding supper was cooked by Delaney herself, which people told her was unnecessary, that she should let someone else handle it, that it was her wedding. She told them she could think of no better way to spend the afternoon of her wedding than cooking for the people she intended to spend her life with. And that was true. And also, she would have admitted privately, it was the only way she knew how to fully inhabit a good thing, by doing something real inside it. The food was good. The evening was long. The valley held the summer warmth until almost midnight. There's something worth saying about what Delaney Crowe's story actually is, when you look at it honestly, without tidying it up. It isn't a story about a woman who survived because she was exceptional. She was capable and intelligent and determined, yes, but the honest account includes the blistered feet and the $11, and the fear she admitted to Cole on an Oakhurst lunch counter, the genuine fear of someone who knows the odds and chooses to proceed anyway. It includes the ways she didn't win cleanly, the witnesses who stumbled at the hearing, the woman who crossed the street to avoid her, the loss she couldn't recover, the father she couldn't save. It's a story about what becomes possible when you take your knowledge seriously, even when the knowledge was purchased at a cost you didn't choose to pay. Delaney understood Harlan Voss because she'd been destroyed by him once. That destruction, which could have been only a wound, became instead a map of something she was never going to be surprised by again. The worst thing that happened to her became the most useful thing she carried. That's not a comfortable lesson. It requires believing that the hard things accumulate into something other than damage. That experience and loss and the grinding work of starting over can be tools rather than only scars. Most people don't fully believe that while they're in the middle of it. Delaney didn't either, walking across the cold Colorado prairie with blisters on her feet and a dead man's journal in her bag. She just kept walking because the alternative was standing still, and standing still had never been something she could tolerate for long. The other thing worth saying is this: she didn't fix everything. Voss was still in Ridgeback, diminished but not finished, operating in a narrower space than before but still operating. The Ferris family's loss was not retrieved. The years of her father's gradual dispossession couldn't be run backward. Justice arrived partial and slow, the way it usually does, which is either a reason to give up on it or a reason to understand that partial and slow is still worth the effort, because the alternative to partial and slow justice is none at all. She chose to understand it as worth the effort. That choice, repeated in different forms across months and years, is what the story is actually about. Blackthorn Ranch in the years that followed became a place that people pointed to when they described what a working ranch in Colorado could look like. Not the largest, not the richest, but steady and real, and run by people who understood that a place is only as good as the care put into it, and that care is something you have to choose every day, not once. The kitchen garden that Delaney and Pip had covered with canvas in a March snowstorm produced through August. The sourdough starter that she'd found in a crock on her first night at the ranch was still going 5 years later, fed and maintained and producing the biscuits that Dex had announced were the best he'd had on a drive, which remained a low bar and a genuine compliment in equal measure. Rooster stayed until he decided not to, which was several years after he'd told himself he'd stay, a season or two. And when he left, it was on his own terms, and with a handshake from Cole that lasted longer than handshakes usually do. Pip wrote to his mother every week. She eventually came to visit, a small, determined woman from Missouri who looked at the ranch, and at her son, and at Delaney, and said, in the direct way of women who have spent their lives managing reality, he said you were the reason he stayed. He was right to stay. Delaney told her that Pip had done the staying himself, that she'd just given him something to stay for. His mother said those were the same thing. Delaney thought about it and concluded she was probably correct. The county got a new commissioner in the summer, a man named Ferris, no relation to the Cedar Flat family, who ran on a platform of procedural transparency that would have sounded like a specific message to anyone who'd been paying attention. Alderman said he was cautiously optimistic. Delaney said she'd believe it when she saw it. Both of those positions were, she thought, the right ones to hold. Harlan Voss sold 3 properties in the district over the following 2 years. He did not sell them at the prices he'd imagined. The landscape had changed, and changing landscapes require new calculations, and some calculations come up short. Delaney heard about each sale through the county information network that Margaret Hale anchored with the steady reliability of a woman who understood that community knowledge was a form of protection, and each time she received the information she noted it, filed it, and returned to whatever she was doing. She did not celebrate. Partial and slow was still partial, but she noted it. The Eastern Creek ran through the Blackthorn Valley the same way it had always run, indifferent to the legal arguments that had been made in its name, carrying snowmelt from the high country down through the valley floor and past the eastern fence line and on into the broader watershed beyond. In spring it ran fast and cold and slightly milky with snowmelt. In summer it settled into a clear, deliberate current that Delaney could hear from the kitchen garden in the evening quiet. She heard it on a June night in the year after the wedding, standing at the garden gate with the last of the light dying on the western ridge, and she thought about the road from Ridgeback and how far it had run and where it had ended up, and she thought that ending up was maybe not the right phrase, that she was not at an ending but at a particular place that she'd arrived at through a particular series of choices and losses and mornings that required getting up and continuing anyway. The creek ran. The valley held the last of the summer light. Behind her, through the kitchen window, Cole was at the table, his papers spread around him, the lamp burning low. The sound of it was ordinary, and ordinary was, she had decided, the most underrated thing that existed. Ordinary was what you fought for. Ordinary was what was worth the cost of the hard road that led to it. She stood for another moment at the garden gate, in the last light, listening to the water. Then she went inside.